Today, we're looking at Krishna's Wild Cherry. Hi, I'm Adam, and I'm an ink guy. There's timestamps down below so that you can skip around, but if you got the time, I would appreciate if you check out the entire video. Also, if you're interested, you can check me out over on Instagram, and if you're new here and like fountain pen inks, I would invite you to subscribe. In order to make sure I have a range of experience with this ink, I do the writing samples. I then put the ink into this Kaweco brass sport with a broad nib. I wrote with it for a day and used it to take the notes for this video. In order to have some standardization while looking at writing samples, I always use Clairfontaine, Tomoe River, and Rhodia paper, although there are additional writing samples that occur much later in the video. Now, let's look at the writing sample. I picked this ink up in bottle form, and to make sure I keep my writing samples consistent, I use a Jinhao 159 with a Goulet 1.1 stub, a Jinhao X450 with a Goulet medium, and a Jinhao X750 with a Goulet extra fine. Let's take a look at the Clairfontaine. We get no bleeding, no ghosting. The 1.1 has no feather, spread, halo sheen. It has only some spots with some shading. Like when you look at the word wild, it starts lighter and it works its way a little bit darker with some lighter spots in it. The extra fine is the same tone as the 1.1 with no feather, spread, halo, sheen, and again, we have shading, but here it's a lot more for being in that extra fine. You look at the word the, it goes from light into very dark into a nice mid-tone. Quick, starts very light, goes to mid and works its way darker, and then in the K becomes lighter in spots again. Brown starts very dark and becomes much lighter. Very nice. 5 seconds to dry. The medium, a noticeably darker tone than the extra fine with no feather, spread, halo sheen, and it still offers bits of shading. Like when you look at the word over, it starts nice and light, works its way to very dark at the R. The is a very dark word which shows nicely underneath brown where it's gone from dark to much lighter. So we get really good shading here with the medium. 6 seconds to dry. Now the scrubby for both, you have to look at the far left to far right. The scrubby for both do show color variation, which we do get in the writing sample. Tomoe River has no bleeding, has the normal Tomoe River ghosting. It's because it's so thin. The 1.1 has no feather, spread, halo sheen, no shade. The extra fine has no feather, spread, halo sheen, or shade. It's the same tone as the 1.1, and it took 8 seconds to dry. Now the medium is a noticeably darker tone than what we got with the extra fine. It has no feather, spread, halo sheen, and no shade, but the tone difference we get is controlled by the nib and the flow. 13 seconds to dry. The scrubby for both show us no color variation. We didn't expect it, and we didn't get it. And Rhodia paper. No bleeding, no ghosting. The 1.1 has no feather, spread, halo sheen, no shading going on here. The extra fine is the same tone as the 1.1 with no feather, spread, halo sheen, and minor spots in shading. Like the K in quick is much darker. The HE in the is much darker than the T. Lazy has some very nice shading because it gets dark to medium to dark to lighter tone. Dog starts light and works its way darker. Very nice shading that's going on here. It's much more subtle. 6 seconds to dry. Now the medium, again, a noticeably darker tone than the extra fine with no feather, spread, halo sheen, and it still offers spots of shading. Like Fox in the down loop is slightly lighter than the up of the F and the O next to it. The is noticeably darker than the word over right next to it. 8 seconds to dry. Now the scrubby for the extra fine, looking far left to far right, you see some good color variation, which we did get. The medium shows no color variation, although we do get some in the medium writing. I agree with Vita that there's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. I put a line of ink down and immediately put it into water for 10 to 15 seconds. And what we see is very interesting on this magenta ink because it's got different tones in the writing. What we see is the magenta across the bottom that's pushing its way up with no real resistance to it. But then we get this much more pink leaning magenta at the top. The one on the right, I let dry for 10 minutes before I dunk it into water. And the real difference we see between them is this dark setting in gray line across the bottom. It makes me feel that there may be little bits of resistance with this ink. Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it might be to clean from your pen. I let the smear dry for 3 days before testing it. Looking at the highlighter, my eye is immediately drawn to the blowout that's occurring in the capital H. It makes me feel a little weary using it as a note taker because I'm afraid of losing something important. Now, water is only lifting the darkest tones off the paper. It's leaving a lot of ink behind, which makes me feel like water is not going to be enough to really get the job done. Pen Flush does everything that water does, and not a whole lot more. It's really not making more of the ink go away, which makes me feel like Pen Flush isn't going to be enough. Even 1/3 bleach solution, while it lifted all the magentas and it lifted all that kind of pink leaning magenta, it's leaving some of the grays behind in this. Now, this means that you'd have to use the 1/3 bleach solution to get this out of your pen, and just make sure that you immediately flush it with water to make sure you don't rust your metal bits. I test viscosity or flow by using a tilt test that I've linked in this video. For the inks I've tested, I have found an average viscosity of 2.5, with the realm of normal being from 2.1 to 2.9. Krishna's Wild Cherry has a viscosity of 1.59, making this a very wet ink. To find my average dry times, I use my writing samples done on Clairfontaine, Tomoe River, and Rhodia paper. I average those. Now for the inks I've tested, I have found an average dry time of 17 seconds, with the realm of normal being from 13 to 21 seconds. Krishna's Wild Cherry has an average dry time of 8 seconds, making this a very fast drying ink. Now while it's very wet, there may not be a lot of stuff in it, which is a reason that it can dry a bit quicker. Also, on the second chromatography, we saw that gray line that really went in, so some of this ink is really getting into the paper much faster. And so it may not be a dry time thing so much as it's seeping into the paper and bonding faster. Instead of finding inks that look like Krishna's Wild Cherry, I would prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Now I was looking for a nice turquoise ink, and I went with Colorverse Morning Star. The second writing sample is done on yellow Rhodia, the hazel notebook, and Canson Bristol paper. I use the yellow paper in writing samples to be able to see any kind of color differences of what's going on, and what we see when we put the yellow Rhodia next to the white Rhodia is that it becomes a bit darker, just a little bit darker, in the lighter tones. Now, the darker tones are the dark tones. These are the same, but this one is a little bit darker than this one for having the yellow background. It does show me that this is a very opaque ink. It really can cover the lines in your writing or the dots on the dot pad. It's very nice. It holds in very well. Next up is hazel paper, the hazel notebook. It has no bleeding, no ghosting. The 1.1 has no feather spread, halo sheen, and no shading. Now this paper tends to absorb the ink pretty quickly, which is where the shading gets to go away. The extra fine gives us mostly the same tone as the 1.1. It has no feather spread, halo sheen, but it definitely gives us spots with shading. Like the K in quick is much darker, the H in the is darker, the word the right here is darker than the word over right next to it, and even the word brown goes from dark to light. It took 2 seconds to dry. Medium is a noticeably darker tone than the extra fine, with no feather spread, halo sheen, and no shading here. Only 3 seconds to dry, making this a great walk-around notebook with a lot of inks. Now the scrubby for both the extra fine and the medium show us no color variation, although on the extra fine we did get some color variation. This is Canson Bristol Artist Paper, and it's just fun for me to use a bunch of times because it holds up to a lot. I did not expect any bleeding or ghosting, and I didn't get any because it's quite thick. The 1.1 has no feather spread, halo sheen, no shade. It's a very pink leaning magenta at this point. The extra fine is the same tone as the 1.1. It has no feather spread, halo sheen, or shade. 4 seconds to dry. The medium, again, much darker. It becomes much more magenta than the pink leaning extra fine. The medium has no feather, spread, halo sheen, or shade, 6 seconds to dry. Now the scrubby of the extra fine, looking left to right, shows us color variation. Although we got none up here, I did have to go back over that to try and get it darker. The medium shows us none, and we got none. And that's all that I have for the writing samples. What do I think of Krishna's Wild Cherry? This is a good, well-behaved ink and a great alternative to people that don't care for red inks. I have a very hard time finding red inks, but this fills in that space for me so I can use less red and more magentas. As far as what pen is going to help bring out the best writing experience from this ink, for me, it was a dry stub. Dry pens in general, but especially a stub. It made this ink even more interesting than it already is. I'm going to remind you that I'm here every day with a new ink review. Thanks for watching.